Great Women of the Christian Faith by Edith Deen. Section 1, Chapter 1, Part 3. Reading performed by Dahl Russell. Marcella, founder of the first religious community for women in the Western Church, who lived from 325 to 410. Quote, in the oratory of her palace in Rome, Jerome taught the Bible to Roman women. Later, Marcella established the first convent for women in the Western Church. When the Goths sacked Rome, they beat her, attempting to make her reveal the hiding place of her fortune, but she had already given it to the poor. End quote. Title. Her, quote, Church of the Household, end quote, was famous in Rome. Marcella, a beautiful and wealthy woman of Rome and a descendant of the old and noble family of Marcelli, is famous not for her fine clothes, carriages, or marble palace with its gold ceiling, but for her love of the Scriptures and her leadership of the 4th century community of Christian women. Her most lasting fame is as founder of the first convent in the Western Church. She received her inspiration for this as a little girl, when her mother Albina extended hospitality to Athanasius, Patriarch of Alexandria, who was then in exile. She listened spellbound while this venerable prelate told of the monks living in the Egyptian desert. The memory of their example never left her, and when, many years later, she was widowed by the premature death of her husband, she was inspired by the devotion of these ascetic Christians of the desert to turn her sumptuous palace on the Aventine in Rome into a Christian retreat from the frivolity and corruption of the capital. She set apart an oratory for Christian worship. The noblest of women of Rome came to her home to hear discourses on the Bible by Jerome, father and doctor of the Church. He had arrived in Rome from Constantinople in 382 to attend a church council. He was assigned as a guest to the hospitality of Marcella. She persuaded him to hold the classes for some of Rome's most distinguished women. Never before had the city witnessed such enthusiasm in the study of the Scriptures, and never before was there assembled for such study so distinguished and intelligent a group of women. They listened avidly to the great Bible authority, for he was translating the original Hebrew and Greek texts into Latin versions called the Vulgate, which was to become the Bible of Christendom for 1,000 years. Jerome remained in Rome for 3 years, working on his translation, instructing his hostess and her friends, and profiting by their criticism. During this time, Marcella asked him questions concerning the Bible, and he found in her such virtue and ability with intuition and spiritual insight. Quote, what had come to me as the fruit of long study and constant meditation, he writes, she learned and made it her own. End quote. So important were Jerome's Bible classes that he later refers to Marcella's palace as the Ecclesia Domestica, or the Church of the Household, an institution which, during the close of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century, was the glory of the Church not only in the West, but also in the East. Marcella's Church of the Household was more than a house of study and prayer. It became a center for deeds of Christian charity and sacrifice. Fabiola received inspiration there to establish the first hospitals in Rome, later spending her immense fortune for the relief of the sick and the dying. There also Paula and her daughter Eustochium made their decision to aid Jerome in his Latin translation of the Bible. Marcella was herself inspired to establish on the outskirts of Rome the first religious retreat for women. Quote, That holy woman Marcella, who set before us a life worthy of the Gospels, end quote, is the way Jerome describes her in one of the 19 epistles he wrote to and about Marcella. After Jerome's departure from Rome for Bethlehem, he frequently advised his friends that Marcella could supply copies of Bible material they requested. Once, when a dispute arose in Rome concerning the meaning of the Scriptures, he asked Marcella to settle it. When Jerome first met Marcella, she doubtless had been a widow for some time. He relates that her husband had died 7 months after their marriage. She had never remarried. For this reason, Jerome frequently compares her to Anna of Jerusalem, mentioned in Luke 2, verses 36 through 38, and describes Marcella as an example of Christian widowhood, commending her in this manner. Quote, Anna lived with her husband 7 years from her virginity, Marcella 7 months. Anna looked for the coming of Christ. Marcella held fast the Lord whom Anna received in her arms. Anna sang his praise when he was still a wailing infant. Marcella proclaimed his glory now that he had won his triumph. Anna spoke of him to all those who waited for redemption of Israel. Marcella cried out with the nations of the redeemed. Epistle 54, end quote. In Jerome's memorial epistle, 127, written 2 years after Marcella's death to her friend Principia, he describes Marcella as young, high-born, and distinguished for her beauty and her self-control. He notes her aristocratic descent from a line of consuls and prefects, but he enlarges more on her virtues than on her birth. Jerome narrates that the illustrious and aged Senator Crealis paid court to Marcella after the death of her husband and offered to make over his fortune to her. Her mother Albina had worked hard to get this wealthy husband for her daughter, but Marcella said to her, quote, Had I a wish to marry, rather than to dedicate myself to perpetual chastity, I should look for a husband and not for an inheritance, end quote. This rejection convinced others that they had no hope of winning Marcella's hand. At that time, Rome was a city of wickedness in which it was almost impossible to attain a stainless reputation. Marcella made this verse her guide. Quote, Blessed are the undefiled in the way, who walk in the law of the Lord, end quote. Psalms 119, verse 1. In order to guard her reputation, she was extremely discreet. She went nowhere in public without her mother as her companion, and would receive no one in her house, not even monks or the clergy, unless others were present. Her companions were virgins and widows, all of them serious rather than frivolous, for she knew that a woman's character is judged by her choice of friends. Rebelling against the immense weight of splendid clothing then in fashion, and the hours devoted to painting the face and curling the hair before a mirror, she adopted a coarse brown dress. Her appearance marked her as consecrated to a religious and self-denying life. Gradually, Marcella attracted a group of women who also aspired to dedicated Christian living. They, too, were women of refinement and education who gave up their frivolities and adopted her manner of dress. She soon became the center of a circle of the most influential women in Rome. Marcella lived an ascetic life for many years. She and Principia, whom she had brought up and loved as a daughter, found a place in the suburbs of Rome where they and other women could live in monastic seclusion. Quote, I had the joy of seeing Rome transformed into another Jerusalem, end quote, writes Jerome. Religious homes for women who longed to live a deeply Christian life soon became numerous. Here women devoted themselves to prayer, to the study of scriptures, to the singing of psalms in Hebrew, and to the relief of the poor. Marcella lived a life of prayer so completely that she spent much time in the churches dedicated to the apostles and martyrs. There she escaped from the throngs in the streets, and in the distractions of the city. She spent time, too, studying the Scriptures, and often, when she did not understand their meaning, she would write Jerome in Bethlehem, asking him to enlighten her. Her delight in the Scriptures, writes Jerome, was incredible. She was forever singing, quote, "Thy words have I hid in mine heart, that I might not sin against thee," end quote. Psalms 119:11. She also would sing the psalm describing the perfect man, end quote. "His delight is in the law of the Lord, and his law doth he meditate day and night," end quote. Psalms 1, verse 2. This meditation on the law, Jerome says, Marcella understood not as a mere review of written words, but as something requiring action. In one letter she asked him, quote, "What are the things which an eye hath not seen, nor ear heard?" End quote. 1 Corinthians 2:9. Jerome answered that these are spiritual things which can only be spiritually discerned. He frequently wrote to her about things of the Spirit. Word of a friend's death came to her while Marcella and Jerome were studying the 73rd Psalm. Later in the day he wrote her a letter, praising her dead friend and concluding with, quote, "We must not seek to possess both Christ and the world. No. Things eternal must take the place of things transitory," end quote. At another time, Jerome wrote to Marcella about Paula's daughter, Blasila, who had been criticized for her austerities. Quote, "A person who cavils at lives like hers has no claim to be considered a Christian," end quote. Most of Jerome's letters to Marcella were written from the Holy Land. He described the charms of the sacred places and urged her to leave Rome and come to Bethlehem to join her old companions, among whom were Paula and her daughter Eustochium. But Marcella never went to the Holy Land. When Alaric and his Goths sacked the city of Rome, some of the blood-stained victors found their way into Marcella's religious house. She received them without any appearance of alarm. When they asked her for gold, she pointed to her coarse dress to show them that she was poor and had no buried treasure. Not believing that a woman of her station would have chosen poverty, they beat her with whips. Marcella is said to have felt no pain at this brutal treatment, but to have thrown herself at their feet, pleading tearfully that her younger friend Principia be spared what she, an old woman of 85, did not fear. Jerome relates that Christ softened the men's heart, for they sent Marcella and her friend to the Basilica of St. Paul, then used as a sanctuary for the poor and afflicted. She thanked God for delivering them unharmed, and rejoiced that the victors had found her poor, not made her so, for she had already given all of her wealth away. A few days after these events, the aged Marcella died. She had named Principia the heir to her poverty, thus showing a real understanding of Paul's exhortations to the Corinthians. Quote, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich." End quote. 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. True wealth, Marcella knew, is of the Spirit. Monica, mother of Augustine, who lived from 331 to 387. Quote, "One of the most prayerful mothers in history, Monica helped to save her erring son, and he became one of the greatest men in the Church." End quote. Title: The Model of Christian Mothers. Monica's tears over her son's evil ways and her prayers for him during 18 years that saved Augustine for the Church. It was Augustine who, as Bishop of Hippo, saved Christianity when the Roman Empire was falling apart, and who gave hopeless and bewildered men confidence in the eternal city of God. Augustine records in his Confessions that his mother was born of Christian parents in 331 A.D. at Tagaste, an ancient Roman town about 150 miles from Carthage. Her husband Patricius, a burgess of Tagaste, though pagan by birth, became a Christian later in his life. In 354 A.D., when Augustine was born, Monica was 23 years old. She had another son, Navigus, and a daughter. Though Augustine does not give his sister's name, other sources say it was Perpetua. In naming her daughter, Monica may have been familiar with the story of one of the first Christian women martyrs, Vibia Perpetua. Monica maintained loving relationships with her family, even with her mother-in-law, who was at first prejudiced against her by the whisperings of malicious servants. Monica won over her mother-in-law by her patience and humility, so that not only was domestic peace established between them, but they learned to live together with what Augustine calls, quote, a wonderful sweetness and mutual goodwill, end quote. With her husband, who was an irritable man, Monica exercised the same patience. When her friends marveled that she endured her husband's fury and asked what remarkable rules she used, she confided her secret. In his moments of violent temper, she held her peace, for she had learned that, quote, an angry husband should not be resisted, neither in deed nor in word, end quote. But as soon as he was calm and tranquil again, she would quietly tell him her feelings and opinions. Monica showed herself, quote, such a peacemaker between differing and discordant spirits, end quote, says her son, that when she learned on both sides of the most bitter things, she would disclose nothing about the one to the other, save what might bring about peace between them. She won her husband over so completely that when he died in 371 A.D., when she was 40, he too had become a servant of God. At her husband's death, she turned to the wearing of her distinctive emblem, a widow's dress with a black robe and a white or gray veil. Monica has inspired many great works of art and literature. Ary Scheffer, in his painting of Monica and Augustine, which hangs in the National Gallery in London, depicts her in this attire. She is gazing heavenward with her hands clasped. In the Church of Sancto Spirito at Florence, the painting by Filippo Lippi shows her seated on a throne, of each side of which stands a group of Christian women. In this church there is also a picture of Monica with her son. Van Dyck depicts her kneeling and looking up to Augustine, who, in his ecstatic vision, is borne up by angels and beholds the opening heavens and Christ the Lord. Matthew Arnold bases his sonnet, Monica's Last Prayer, on the moving scene at her deathbed when she tells her son, "This only I ask, that you will remember me at the Lord's altar, wherever you may be." Francis de Sales, 17th century Bishop of Geneva, says that Monica, like Hannah, consecrated her son to God before his birth. Augustine relates that his father, quote, did not trouble himself with how I grew towards God or how chaste I was, so long as I was skillful in my studies, end quote. But of his mother he writes, quote, in her breast thou hadst even begun thy temple and the commencement of thy holy habitation, end quote. He speaks of her as God's handmaid, who poured into his ears much about God, none of which sank into his heart until he was older. Quote, for she despised, and I remember privately warned me with a great solicitude not to commit fornication, but above all things never to defile another man's wife, end quote. These appeared to the youthful Augustine as, quote, womanish counsel, end quote, which he says, quote, I would blush to obey, end quote. Later, Augustine confesses that these words of counsel were God's and not just his mother's. Quote, "But this I knew not," he says, "and rushed on headlong into such blindness that among my equals I was ashamed to be less shameless." End quote. As Augustine walked what he called the streets of Babylon, reveling in its moral filth, end quote, "as in cinnamon and precious ointments," end quote, his mother continued to pray for him. In his 16th year, he committed theft and enjoyed the company of his fellow sinners who stole with him. He said that it was a pleasure to him to laugh when seriously deceiving others. Through all this period, his faithful mother did not cease praying for him. At 17, Augustine left his birthplace for the great city of Carthage, where, as he expressed it, quote, "a cauldron of unholy loves bubbled up all around me," end quote. At 16, he took a mistress and had a son by her. Later, he joined the Manichaeans, an heretical group. These and other excesses he records in his Confessions, the most intimate and soul-searching of all autobiographies. At last he tells how God, quote, "drew his soul out of the profound darkness," end quote, because of his mother who, he says, wept on his behalf more than most mothers weep when their children die. Quote, "For she saw that I was dead by that faith and spirit which she had from thee, and thou heardest her, O Lord, thou heardest her, and despisest not her tears when pouring down. They watered the earth under her eyes in every place where she prayed. Yea, thou heardest her." End quote. In a dream, Monica was consoled when she saw herself standing on a wooden rule symbolizing the rule of faith. A bright youth was advancing towards her, joyous and smiling, while she was grieving and bowed down with sorrow. The youth inquired of her the cause of her sorrow, and she answered that it was her son's destruction she was lamenting. But the youth asked her to see that where she was, there was I also. Then she saw in the dream her son Augustine standing near her on the same rule. Monica related this dream to her son, and he tried to interpret it as meaning that she would become a Manichaean as he was, but his devout mother replied, quote, "No, for it was not told me that where he is thou shalt be, but where thou art there shall he be." End quote. Though the dream allayed her anxiety, her son did not change immediately. For nearly 9 years he, quote, "wallowed in slime, striving often to rise, but being all the more heavily dashed down." End quote. When Monica asked a certain bishop to talk to her son, the bishop refused, saying that he was still unteachable. "Leave him alone for a while," the bishop said to Monica. "Only pray God for him. He will of himself, by reading, discover what that error is, and how great his impiety." End quote. Monica was still not satisfied, and repeated her entreaties until the bishop exclaimed, "Go thy way, and God bless thee, for it is not possible that the son of these tears should perish." End quote. Monica accepted the bishop's words as though they were a voice from heaven. Augustine left Carthage for Rome. When he moved on to Milan, Monica decided to follow him. Though it was dangerous for a widow to travel alone, quote, "My mother felt secure in thee," end quote, Augustine later commented. Even the sailors came to her for comfort in a storm, and she assured them of a safe arrival because God had foretold it to her in a vision. When Monica arrived at Milan, she found to her great joy that her son was no longer a Manichaean. Though he was not yet a Christian, the good news was more than she had expected at this moment. Monica had mourned her son as one dead to the spirit, but now she had renewed confidence that he would be raised up to God. Augustine said that his mother remembered the words of Jesus to the son of the widow of Nain, quote, "Young man, I say unto thee, arise," end quote. Luke chapter 7, verse 14. Monica, a widow too, had a son who was virtually dead. But as she repeated these words of Jesus to herself, she knew that her son too would arise. In Milan, she listened to the counsel of Bishop Ambrose, who said that the, quote, fountain of living water, end quote, John chapter 4, verse 10, of which Jesus had spoken to the woman of Samaria, would spring up into everlasting life in her son also. Ambrose and Monica became friends because of their mutual interest in Augustine, and because Ambrose was impressed with Monica's fervency of spirit and her loyalty to the Church. He often praised her to her son, and congratulated Augustine that he had such a mother. Monica urged her son to take a wife, and she thought he had heeded her advice when he sent his mistress of some 15 years back to Africa. Instead of marrying, however, Augustine dismissed this mistress, only to choose another. Augustine's spirit had a long struggle with the flesh, until a turning point came one day when he went into a garden. He flung himself down under a fig tree and cried out to God, quote, "How long, Lord, wilt thou be angry forever? Why is there not this hour an end to my uncleanness?" End quote. Suddenly he heard the voice of a child singing in the garden, quote, "Take up and read, take up and read." End quote. Quickly he took up a volume of St. Paul's epistles and read Romans chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. Quote, "Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof." End quote. He read no further, for instantly, quote, all the gloom of doubt vanished away. End quote. Augustine hurried to Monica to tell her what had happened. Monica's grief was turned into gladness, quote, much more plentiful than she had desired, and much dearer and chaster than she used to crave. End quote. Acknowledging his own wickedness, Augustine now praised God, the author of safety, and Jesus Christ, the Redeemer. Quote, "O Lord, truly am I thy servant, and the son of thy handmaiden." End quote, he said. On Easter Day in 387, Augustine and his son Deodatus were baptized by Bishop Ambrose of Milan. With his conversion, he lost all desire for fame, marriage, or riches. Augustine, his mother, and a handful of devoted friends now decided to return to Africa. En route, they stopped at Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber River, to rest. Augustine records the conversation he had there with his mother by a window overlooking the garden of the house they occupied. Each heart opened to the other, and they talked for hours of God and his works. With the tumult of the flesh silenced, Augustine remembered, quote, "We created not ourselves, but were created by him who abideth forever." End quote. Turning to her son, Monica spoke, quote, "Son, for myself I have no longer any pleasure in this life. What I want here further, and why I am here, I know not, now that my hopes in this world are satisfied. There was indeed one thing for which I wished to tarry a little in this life, and that was that I might see thee a Catholic Christian before I died. My God has exceeded this abundantly, so that I see thee despising all earthly felicity. What do I do here?" End quote. 5 days later, while they were still in Ostia, Monica became ill, and calling Augustine to her, said, quote, "Here shall you bury your mother." End quote. Her son, Navigus, had expressed the wish that she might die in her own country, but when Monica heard this, she told Augustine, quote, "Lay this body anywhere. Let not the care of it trouble you at all. This only I ask, that you will remember me at the Lord's altar, wherever you be." End quote. Then, as Augustine records, she receded silently into her pain. She did not dread being buried far from home, for as she herself had once said, quote, "Nothing is far to God, nor need I fear lest he should be ignorant at the end of the world of the place when he is to raise me up." End quote. In 387 A.D., on the 9th day of her illness, and at the age of 56, Monica died. Of his mother's funeral, Augustine writes, quote, "We did not consider it fitting to celebrate it with tearful plaints and groanings, for on such wise are they who die unhappy, or are altogether dead, wont to be mourned. But she neither died unhappy, nor did she altogether die. For of this were we assured by the witness of her good conversation, her faith unfeigned, and other sufficient grounds." End quote. End of Part 3 of Chapter 1, Section 1, Great Women of the Christian Faith by Edith Deen. Reading performed by Dahl Russell.